Let me open with a fundamental observation that I think we as Israelis must always keep in mind. As much as we watch these American elections with great interest and we passionately argue behind closed doors who we prefer, Israel must always work with both major parties in the United States. With the Democratic Party, with the Republican Party, and with whomever is elected in November. Now that may seem obvious, but many of the pundits already assume that Israel has its preferences and that certain scenarios that could develop in November will have very difficult consequences. I think Israel will work with whoever is elected. But let me try and get into this subject by trying to comb out some of the issues that have come up in the last 4 years, and I think will be with us in the future. I contend that every presidential candidate is elected with certain predispositions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about the Arab-Israel conflict, and the Middle East as a whole. And part of what occurs in the first year or two, sometimes it takes longer, is adjusting those predispositions to the reality of the Middle East. So you come with a certain program, and you find that in the course of trying to implement that program, it doesn't work. And it happens to presidents from both parties. Some of the issues in the area of predispositions that are obvious to anyone is the notion, for example, that the Palestinian issue is central to the stability of the Middle East, that if you resolve the Palestinian issue tomorrow, the whole issue of Middle East stability will snap together like a large jigsaw puzzle from Morocco out to Pakistan. And that's so obviously not true for anyone who lives here, but it's a temptation, and almost an ideological temptation, that seem to have come up in certain circles around President Obama. I think the Arab Spring has put that to rest, because perhaps the most important development in the Middle East, I would say not since World War II, since World War I, had absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. And I think that has now sunk in to even advocates of that school of thought, who I am sure had an influence on Middle East policy, certainly in the early Obama years, but also among some of his predecessors. Second issue, of course, is Iran, which is the most critical issue for the coming year. President Obama began his term in office with a policy of engagement. You might remember President Bush said that the cessation of Iranian enrichment in accordance with, at that time, 5 Security Council resolutions, was a prerequisite for any U.S.-Iranian dialogue. And of course, U.S. policy was already shifting in the latter Bush years under the leadership of Condoleezza Rice. But it was really President Obama who took this a step further, dropped the preconditions for negotiations, and pursued this idea of reaching out to the Iranians. It didn't really work. And we can see that the administration's policy towards Iran has substantially changed. It has moved towards, first of all, the idea that if Iran should acquire nuclear weapons, the United States is not going to get into the business of containing a nuclear Iran. Even before it gets to nuclear weapons, the President has made clear that policy of the United States is to prevent a nuclear Iran. That's a big shift. Just 2 years earlier, I remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was speaking about providing an umbrella, sort of like extended deterrence in the old Cold War model, to the Arab states. And then President Mubarak, who actually was once president of Egypt, resisted that idea, and it became clear that the Arab states would probably try and acquire nuclear weapons themselves if Iran went nuclear. So obviously, that was a very important shift, and it was really a product of how reality affected thinking in Washington. There was also a notion that you needed to develop an Arab consensus with the United States and the West on Iran to help contain Iran. And that consensus would have to be built by moving Israeli-Arab diplomacy forward. That was a policy of linkage that was in many people's minds. I recall, just reflecting where these ideas pop up, I recall being on an MSNBC show in the morning, and I was asked, don't you think if Israel would stop its settlements, it would help President Obama contain Iran? And so I stopped for a minute, and I turned to the interviewer and I said, listen, imagine you are the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, and you were told that America putting together a coalition against Iran is dependent on preventing the residents of a Sumerian settlement called Itamar from building verandas. You, as the Saudi defense minister, would it be more important for you to stop the building of those verandas in Itamar, or to see a coalition of countries protecting the Ras Tanura oil outlets in the Persian Gulf from being attacked by the Revolutionary Guards? I mean, that was a rhetorical question, but I framed it in a way that made it pretty clear that putting the minutiae of the Israeli-Palestinian issue forward as a precondition for resolving the containment issues on Iran was just ridiculous. And I think that has sunk into many people. It doesn't require a TV show on MSNBC in the morning to pass that message on. An issue which I think where we've had our differences, and they came up in May 2011, was when President Obama mentioned the question of the 1967 lines. You might remember President Obama had two speeches. One was at the State Department, the second one was at AIPAC. The first one was supposed to be about Arab Spring, but at the end of it there was a reference to the 67 lines being a basis for negotiations, of course with land swaps. And I think that was a kind of stunning moment in our relationship. I've studied the statements of American presidents on the 1967 lines, and I hadn't seen it as a positive basis for negotiations, even with the qualification of land swaps. I had seen it as something that the United States wasn't going to advocate. So this seemed to be a shift. Luckily, President Obama seemed to pull back from that statement in his subsequent speech at AIPAC, saying that obviously the lines wouldn't necessarily have to be the 1967 lines. This, I think, represented a certain shift that from what Israel had seen, let's say in relationship to President Obama's predecessor. You might remember that on April 14th, 2004, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon received a letter from President Bush, specifically stating that Israel was not expected to go back to the 1949 armistice line, which is the correct language of the 67 line, the technical language of it, and would be entitled to defensible borders so that Israel could defend itself by itself. For whatever reason, that letter somehow evaporated in the diplomatic discussions, even though it had been approved by both houses of Congress by bipartisan majorities. But I think after the inevitable train wreck that occurred in May 2011 over the 67 line issue, I think the administration understood what Prime Minister Netanyahu said to a joint session of Congress, that the 1967 line is indefensible, and that, as the Prime Minister was asserting, without going into the details of maps, Israel was entitled to, indeed needed, a new line which would be a defensible line. So I think the idea was communicated. By the way, I think the President had very, let's say, good motives for adopting a policy which we disagreed with. He wanted to build European support for blocking a move by the Palestinian Authority, by the PLO, at the UN to have Palestine recognized as a state, a member state of the UN and the Security Council, or any upgrade in the General Assembly. And he felt he needed to give the Europeans the 67 lines. He didn't need to give Abu Mazen the 67 lines. But he did. He had European support at the UN. It didn't change one iota Palestinian policy. They still refused to engage with Israel diplomatically. But it clearly represented a point of friction. And I assume that whoever is elected in November will not insist that Israel pull back to the 1967 lines, which reminds me, I think, of a fundamental point, even I would say a weakness on the Israeli side, that we have to get over. It is absolutely critical for Israel to explain itself in crystal clear terms. It's not something that should be taken for granted. You don't always want to put forward or even be very assertive about your position when you're involved in delicate negotiations. You don't want to chase away the other side. And second of all, you don't want to make declarations that every other day create a kind of crisis of U.S.-Israel relations if you have different views over such sensitive issues as Israel's ultimate borders. But against those considerations, it is vital that Israel inform its supporters, inform the international community, what is the consensus in this country and behind the government of Israel about what Israel's needs are. I always used to say when I speak to an Israeli prime minister before a visit to Washington, I'd say, tell the president what you can do and what you can't do. But you gotta say what you can't do. You can't leave an impression that everything is possible. And that's not just a talk between myself and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I've met with other Israeli prime ministers as well. But we don't always do that, and we don't always make clear what our interests are. I know that Stu Eisenstadt mentioned perhaps the Republicans are more in line with the Likud. Today, I think what has happened in Israel is that we have a new political center that's emerging. I think it is much less left and right, although I'm sure there are people who write op-eds in Haaretz who would complain at that statement. But I think we have a massive political center that's emerging. It has Likud at its core, but it now has Kadima, and it has adopted positions that were once mainstream positions of the Israeli Labor Party, like defensible borders, which comes right out of the school of Yigal Allon and Yitzhak Rabin. And therefore, I think what we need to do when we speak to the U.S., to whoever is elected and comes into office with a first term or a second term in January, is make clear what that consensus is. That consensus exists in public opinion polls. That consensus exists in terms of the basis of the current government, which now has 94 members of Knesset. And I think that consensus reflects how Israelis understand the difficult situation that Israel finds itself in with the rapid changes that are occurring in our region. Prime Minister Netanyahu, about a year ago, was at a Passover toast for the Likud party. And he was talking about the positions that he would adopt in the peace process, and he says, and he was talking about the Arab Spring, he said, there are trees that have fallen, there are trees that will fall, and there are trees that are now shaking. He was talking about many of the regimes around us. We simply do not know who will be in power in 5 years in what's called the Mashrek, the Arab East. And that obviously creates a pause on our part about how we manage ourselves diplomatically in an era of such uncertainty. Well, that discussion we have to have with the U.S., and we shouldn't sweep it under the rug. So I see we're coming now to the end. Let me summarize. I believe that both candidates will come to the issue of Israel with certain predispositions, but I believe that the reality of what we're facing in the Middle East will lead them to certain fundamental policies towards Israel that will have some degree of similarity, even though there are predispositions that don't always change. Thank you.